Greetings, traveler. You've arrived at a place where time slows down, and the worries of the day begin to fade. Here, we gather to listen to history told not in haste, but in a gentle rhythm meant to calm the mind. Perhaps you're ready to drift into sleep, or perhaps you simply wish for quiet company tonight. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time of day accompanies your journey back through the ages? And if you find these soft retellings of the past comforting, a simple tap on subscribe ensures you'll never miss another night's tale. Now, breathe deeply, rest easily, and let us step into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory. Tonight, we venture into one of history's most misunderstood periods, a span of centuries often dismissed with a phrase that carries the weight of centuries of misunderstanding, the Dark Ages. But what if I told you that this darkness was not the reality of the time, but rather a shadow cast by later generations, a veil drawn across centuries of human achievement, struggle, and transformation? What if the very name itself represents not the absence of light in those distant years, but rather the absence of understanding in our own? Settle in, let your breathing slow, and together we'll explore not just what happened during these centuries, but why they've been so profoundly misrepresented, and what truths lie waiting beneath the accumulated myths of 1,000 years. The term Dark Ages first emerged not from the period itself, but from the minds of Renaissance scholars who looked back across the centuries with a particular agenda. Francesco Petrarca, whom we know as Petrarch, writing in the 14th century, gazed back at the millennium that followed Rome's decline and saw only absence, the absence of classical learning, the absence of Latin eloquence, the absence of the cultural achievements he so admired in ancient texts. For Petrarch and his intellectual descendants, history had reached its pinnacle in Rome and Athens, had fallen into darkness with Christianity's rise and Rome's transformation, and was only now, in their own glorious present, being reborn. They were living, they believed, in a renaissance, a rebirth of learning after a long night of ignorance. But Petrarch was not simply describing what he saw. He was crafting a narrative, creating a story about the past that served the needs of his present. The Renaissance humanists needed the Middle Ages to be dark so that their own age could shine more brightly by comparison. They needed those centuries to represent decline so that their own era could claim to be a restoration. In this way, the very concept of the Dark Ages was born not from historical analysis but from cultural competition, not from careful study of evidence but from the desire to elevate one age at the expense of another. Consider for a moment the sheer duration of what we're discussing. When we speak of the Dark Ages, we're typically referring to a period spanning roughly from the 5th century to the 10th or 11th century, some 500 to 600 years of human history. That's longer than the entire span from the Renaissance to our own time. Imagine dismissing everything from Leonardo da Vinci to the present day as a single, undifferentiated period of darkness. The absurdity becomes apparent. Yet this is precisely what happened when later scholars compressed these centuries into a single, supposedly benighted epoch. The story begins, as so many historical narratives do, with Rome. But not the Rome of gladiators and marble columns that often fills our imagination. By the 4th century after Christ, the Roman Empire had already transformed itself multiple times, had split into Eastern and Western halves, had adopted Christianity as its official religion, and had moved its center of gravity steadily eastward. The city of Rome itself, while still symbolically important, was no longer the true heart of imperial power. That heart now beat in Constantinople, the new Rome, built by Constantine on the ancient site of Byzantium, positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, commanding the straits that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. When we speak of Rome's fall, we must be careful about what we mean. The last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, his name a bitter echo of Rome's legendary founder and first emperor, was deposed in the year 476 by the Germanic general Odoacer. But this was less a cataclysmic collapse than a formalization of changes that had been underway for centuries. The western provinces had long been defended, administered, and increasingly ruled by men of Germanic origin. The imperial bureaucracy had been gradually decentralizing. The economic networks that had once bound the Mediterranean world into a single system had been fragmenting for generations. What happened in 476 was not so much that Rome fell as that the Western imperial government finally admitted it was no longer necessary. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging that there was one empire with one emperor, and that emperor ruled from the east. In Italy and throughout the western provinces, life continued much as before, but under different management. The landowners still collected their rents, the bishops still administered their dioceses, the farmers still planted their crops and tended their animals. The sun rose and set, seasons changed, children were born and grew and had children of their own, and if the coins now bore different names and the tax collectors answered to different masters, well, such things had happened many times before in Rome's long history. But change was indeed coming, change both gradual and profound. The networks of trade that had once connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, were contracting. The roads that Roman legions had marched along for centuries were maintained less regularly. The cities that had been centers of commerce and administration were, in many cases, shrinking within their old walls. Population was declining in some regions, redistributing in others. These were real transformations, but they were neither universal nor uniform, and they certainly did not represent a simple descent into chaos and ignorance. In Gaul, which we now call France, a people called the Franks had been settling for generations, sometimes as Roman federates officially granted land in exchange for military service, sometimes simply as migrants seeking better opportunities. Their kings had learned to blend Germanic warrior traditions with Roman administrative practices, to cooperate with the Catholic bishops who were increasingly the real power brokers in the cities, to see themselves as successors to rather than destroyers of Roman civilization. One of these Frankish kings, Clovis, made a decision around the year 500 that would echo through centuries. He converted to Catholic Christianity, not to the Arian Christianity that many other Germanic peoples had adopted, but to the same faith professed by the Roman population he ruled and by the bishops whose support he needed. This was a political masterstroke, but it was also more than that. It represented a genuine fusion of cultures, a recognition that the future lay not in maintaining separate Germanic and Roman identities but in creating something new that honored both traditions. Picture Clovis on the night before his baptism, standing in the darkness outside the church at Reims, contemplating the step he was about to take. He was a warrior king, descended from lines of pagan chieftains, a man who had won his crown through battle and cunning. Tomorrow he would enter the water and emerge transformed, not just in his own eyes but in the eyes of his subjects, his former enemies now his people, united under one faith. The bishop Remigius would say to him, "Bow your head gently, Sicambrian, adore what you have burned, burn what you have adored." It was a dramatic formulation, but it overstated the case. Clovis was not abandoning his past but transforming it, finding a way to be both Frankish king and Roman ruler, both Germanic warrior and Christian monarch. The kingdom Clovis founded would become the Carolingian Empire under his descendants, and from that empire would eventually emerge both France and Germany, the two great powers that would shape European history for the next millennium and beyond. But that transformation was centuries away. For now, in the 6th and 7th centuries, what mattered was that in the former Roman territories of Western Europe, new political structures were emerging that combined elements of Roman and Germanic tradition in ways that were genuinely creative and adaptive to changing circumstances. Meanwhile, in Italy, another synthesis was taking place. Theodoric the Ostrogoth ruled from Ravenna, governing Romans and Goths alike with a light hand, respecting Roman law and traditions while maintaining Gothic military dominance. He employed Roman senators in his administration, corresponded with philosophers, patronized scholars and artists. His secretary, Cassiodorus, was one of the most learned men of his age, and through Cassiodorus's writings we can glimpse a world that was not dark at all, but rather one in which classical learning was being carefully preserved and transmitted even as political structures transformed around it. Theodoric's mausoleum still stands in Ravenna, a massive structure topped with a dome carved from a single piece of stone weighing 300 tons, brought from Istria across the Adriatic Sea. The engineering required to transport and lift such a stone was formidable, equal to anything the Romans themselves had accomplished. Inside, decorated with mosaics that gleamed in the candlelight, Theodoric was laid to rest in a porphyry sarcophagus fit for an emperor, which, in all but name, is what he had been. But political stability proved fragile in these transitional centuries. After Theodoric's death, the Eastern Emperor Justinian launched a campaign to reconquer the western provinces, to restore the Roman Empire to something approaching its old geographical extent. The wars that followed devastated Italy, turning fertile fields into battlefields, reducing thriving cities to ruins, killing perhaps half the population through a combination of warfare, famine, and disease. The Gothic kingdom fell, but so did much of Italy's prosperity. When the Lombards invaded a few years later, they found a peninsula exhausted by war and unable to mount effective resistance. Yet even amid this destruction, continuity persisted in unexpected ways. The senators might have lost their power, but the bishops gained influence. The old civil administration might have collapsed, but the church stepped in to fill the void, providing not just spiritual guidance but practical governance, feeding the hungry, ransoming captives, mediating disputes, maintaining whatever order could be maintained in chaotic times. Pope Gregory the Great, who led the church from 590 to 604, was essentially the ruler of Rome in all but name, managing the city's food supply, negotiating with Lombard kings, organizing the defense of central Italy, all while writing theological works of enduring influence and reforming the church's liturgy. Gregory came from one of Rome's oldest senatorial families, had served as prefect of the city, the highest civil office, before giving away his wealth and becoming a monk. But his monastic contemplation was interrupted by the church's need for his administrative genius and political skills. He accepted the papacy reluctantly, calling himself the servant of the servants of God, a title that popes still use today. Under his leadership, the papacy became not just a spiritual authority but a temporal power, the guardian of classical learning, the patron of missions that would spread Christianity and literacy to the farthest reaches of Europe. It was Gregory who sent Augustine, not the famous philosopher from North Africa, but another Augustine, to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. The mission landed in Kent in 597, and King Ethelbert, whose wife was already a Christian, received them favorably. Within a generation, much of southern Britain had converted, and missionaries were pushing northward into kingdoms that still worshipped the old gods. The story of this conversion is often told as one of simple replacement, paganism yielding to Christianity, darkness to light. But the reality was far more complex and interesting. The Anglo-Saxons who had settled in Britain after the Roman legions withdrew were themselves relative newcomers, having arrived only a century or so before Augustine's mission. They brought with them rich traditions of poetry and craftsmanship, a complex social structure, and a pantheon of gods who seem strange to us now but who made perfect sense in the context of their world: Woden, the Wanderer and Wisdom Seeker; Thunor, the Thunder Wielder; Tiw, the god of law and war; Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility. These were not primitive people practicing a primitive religion, but rather sophisticated peoples with developed cultural traditions attempting to make sense of their world with the intellectual tools available to them. When Christianity arrived, it did not simply obliterate these traditions. Instead, there was a long period of coexistence, of adaptation, of syncretism. Christian missionaries were instructed to be pragmatic, to convert pagan temples into churches rather than destroying them, to overlay Christian festivals onto existing celebrations, to find points of connection between old beliefs and new. Pope Gregory himself advised his missionaries not to destroy the temples of the idols among the peoples, but to destroy only the idols themselves, then purify the buildings with holy water, set up altars, and place relics there. Thus the people, seeing their temples were not destroyed, would more easily be led to worship the true God. This was not deception but pastoral wisdom, a recognition that human beings change their deepest beliefs slowly and that forcing the pace of change often produces only superficial conversion and lingering resentment. The result was a Christianity that absorbed elements of Germanic culture even as it transformed it, a faith expressed through Germanic poetic forms, understood through the lens of Germanic social values, practiced in ways that made sense to people whose ancestors had never known the Mediterranean world. One of the great literary masterpieces of this fusion is the epic poem Beowulf, composed sometime in the centuries we're discussing, preserved in a manuscript copied around the year 1000. The poem is set in Scandinavia, in the hall of a Danish king named Hrothgar, but it was composed in England and reflects the concerns of Anglo-Saxon Christian culture. It tells of the hero Beowulf, who crosses the sea to help Hrothgar defeat the monster Grendel, a creature descended from Cain, the first murderer in biblical tradition. The poem weaves together Germanic heroic values, loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, generosity in victory, with Christian themes of providence, the transience of worldly glory, the certainty of judgment after death. Listen to the poem's opening lines, as translated into modern English, so. The spear Danes in days gone by and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. The voice that speaks to us across the centuries is that of a Christian poet looking back at pagan heroes with both admiration and melancholy, honoring their courage while recognizing that they lived before Christ came to save them. It's a voice that is simultaneously Germanic and Christian, ancient and medieval, pagan and baptized, and that complex fusion is precisely what makes it so valuable as a window into this supposedly dark age. While Anglo-Saxon England was finding its cultural footing, dramatic changes were transforming the eastern and southern shores of the Mediterranean. In the early 7th century, a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad began to preach a new revelation, a return to the pure monotheism of Abraham, purged of what he saw as the corruptions that had crept into both Judaism and Christianity. His message found few followers at first, and in 622 he and his small community fled from Mecca to Medina, the Hijra, the migration that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Within a decade, Muhammad had unified much of Arabia under his religious and political leadership. Within a generation after his death in 632, his followers had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Persia, building an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of India. This was not simply military conquest, though the speed and scope of the Muslim conquests were indeed remarkable. It was also an intellectual revolution, the emergence of a new civilization that would become one of the great preservers and transmitters of ancient learning. The conventional narrative of the Dark Ages often treats the Islamic conquests as evidence of darkness, as the loss of Christian lands to infidels, as a catastrophe for civilization. But this perspective reveals more about the biases of those who constructed the narrative than about the reality of what happened. The Islamic world of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries was in many ways more advanced than Christian Europe, more urbanized, more commercially sophisticated, more intellectually vibrant. The great cities of Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were centers of learning where Greek philosophy was translated into Arabic, where Persian and Indian mathematics were studied and advanced, where medicine, astronomy, and engineering flourished under the patronage of caliphs who saw scholarship as a religious duty. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded in 762 a city that would become the intellectual capital of the world. Imagine it in its glory, a perfect circle 2 kilometers in diameter, surrounded by 3 concentric walls, with 4 gates opening in the cardinal directions. At the center stood the caliph's palace and the great mosque, their golden domes visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Radiating outward from this center were gardens, libraries, hospitals, markets filled with goods from China and East Africa, from Scandinavia and India. Scholars came from across the known world to study at the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, where texts in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac were collected, translated, analyzed, and synthesized. One of these scholars was al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm, and whose book on algebra, Al-Jabr, the reunion of broken parts, would become one of the most influential mathematical texts in history. Another was Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine remained a standard medical text in European universities until the 17th century. There was al-Razi, called Rhazes, who distinguished between measles and smallpox and wrote pioneering works on pediatrics and ophthalmology. There was Ibn al-Haytham, called al-Hazan, whose book of optics laid the foundations for modern understanding of light, lenses, and vision. These were not men working in isolation but participants in a vast intellectual network that spanned continents. They corresponded with each other, built on each other's work, engaged in spirited debates about mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and theology. They preserved and transmitted the learning of Greece and Rome at a time when much of that learning had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe. They added to it, corrected it, transformed it. When Europeans in the 12th and 13th centuries began seeking out ancient knowledge, they found it not by excavating ruins but by translating Arabic texts that had kept that knowledge alive and growing. But we're getting ahead of our story. Let's return to Western Europe in the 8th century, where another great figure was about to reshape the political and cultural landscape. Charles Martel, whose name means Charles the Hammer, was the de facto ruler of the Frankish kingdom, though he never took the title of king. In 732, he led a Frankish army to meet a Muslim raiding force that had crossed the Pyrenees from Spain. The battle that followed, fought somewhere near Tours or Poitiers, the exact location is uncertain, has been portrayed by some historians as one of the decisive battles of world history, the moment when Christian Europe turned back the Islamic tide. But this interpretation vastly overstates what happened. The Muslim force was a raid, not an invasion, and after their defeat they withdrew to Spain. The Umayyad Caliphate's center of gravity was in Damascus, thousands of miles away, and their primary concerns were eastward looking, toward Persia and Central Asia, not toward the cold forests of Francia. Charles Martel's victory was significant for Frankish politics. It enhanced his prestige and that of his descendants, but it was not the civilization-saving triumph that later chroniclers claimed. What was significant was what Charles Martel's grandson would accomplish. Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne, became king of the Franks in 768 and spent the next 46 years building an empire that at its height encompassed most of Western and Central Europe. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic marriage, and alliance with the papacy, Charlemagne created a political entity that consciously modeled itself on Rome, that saw itself as the successor to and restorer of Roman greatness. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As he rose from his knees, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. According to Charlemagne's biographer Einhard, the king was surprised by this coronation, and had he known the Pope's intention he would not have entered the church that day. This profession of surprise is almost certainly false. Such a momentous act would have required careful planning. But it served a useful purpose, allowing Charlemagne to claim that the imperial dignity had been thrust upon him by the people and by God, rather than seized through his own ambition. What mattered was that for the first time since 476, there was again an emperor in the West, and that emperor ruled over territories that bore at least a family resemblance to the old Roman provinces. The coronation formalized what Charlemagne had already been building, a Christian empire that united Germanic and Roman traditions under the authority of a warrior king who was also a patron of learning and a defender of the church. For Charlemagne saw his role as not simply military and political but cultural and intellectual. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen, Alcuin from York, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Theodulf from Spain, Peter of Pisa, Paulinus of Aquileia, and others whose names are preserved in the records of what came to be called the Carolingian Renaissance. These men established schools, reformed the liturgy, standardized the script used for copying manuscripts, the beautiful Carolingian minuscule from which our lowercase letters descend, and worked to improve the Latin literacy of the clergy. This was the Renaissance part of what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a conscious effort to revive classical learning and raise educational standards across the empire. Monasteries were instructed to establish schools and scriptoria. Standardized textbooks were produced for teaching grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Classical texts that had survived only in scattered, corrupt copies were collected, corrected, and reproduced. Much of classical Latin literature that we possess today survived only because Carolingian monks copied it in this period. Without their efforts, we would have lost Lucretius and Catullus, Tacitus and Livy, Cicero and Horace. The so-called Dark Ages preserved the light of Rome even while transforming it. Charlemagne himself, despite his enthusiasm for learning, never fully mastered the art of writing. Einhard tells us that he kept writing tablets under his pillow and practiced forming letters whenever he had a spare moment, but he started too late in life and never achieved fluency. Yet he could read, spoke Latin and probably some Greek in addition to his native Frankish, and loved to listen to Augustine's City of God being read aloud during meals. He was a complex figure, capable of great brutality. His conquest of Saxony involved decades of war and the massacre of thousands who refused to convert to Christianity, but also capable of genuine learning and cultural vision. The empire Charlemagne built did not long survive his death in 814. His son Louis the Pious lacked his father's force of personality, and Louis's sons fought among themselves over the inheritance. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire was divided into three kingdoms that roughly corresponded to modern France, Germany, and Italy. This division, formalized and modified over subsequent generations, established political boundaries that would shape European history for more than 1,000 years. The idea of a unified Christian empire in the West was shattered, not to be seriously attempted again. But the cultural achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance proved more durable than its political structures. The educational reforms, the scriptoria, the standards of literacy and learning established during Charlemagne's reign created a foundation on which later generations could build. When we think of medieval culture, monks in scriptoria copying manuscripts, cathedral schools teaching the 7 liberal arts, a common Latin culture uniting diverse peoples, we're thinking of institutions and practices that took their distinctive form during this supposedly dark period. And what of the monasteries that were so central to this cultural preservation? Their story takes us back earlier, to the twilight of the Roman world, when a young man from central Italy named Benedict abandoned his studies in Rome, disgusted by the city's vice and corruption, and went to live as a hermit in a cave at Subiaco. There he spent 3 years in prayer and contemplation, developing the spiritual discipline that would eventually produce the rule of Saint Benedict, perhaps the most influential document in the history of Western monasticism. Benedict's rule was remarkable for its moderation and practicality. Previous monastic movements had emphasized extreme asceticism, hermits who lived in the desert eating only bread and salt, who stood in prayer for hours until their feet swelled, who mortified their flesh to free their spirits. Benedict rejected these extremes. His monks would live in community, not isolation. They would pray together 8 times a day, the divine office that structured the monastic day, but they would also work with their hands, study scripture and other books, eat sufficient food to maintain their health, sleep in beds rather than on the bare ground. "Let all things be done in moderation," he wrote, quoting scripture, and moderation became the keynote of Benedictine life. The spread of Benedictine monasticism across Europe created a network of communities that became centers of learning, agricultural innovation, and hospitality. Monasteries preserved not just classical texts but also practical knowledge, how to clear forests and drain swamps, how to breed better livestock and select better crops, how to make wine and cheese and beer, how to organize labor and manage estates. They provided hospitality to travelers in an age when inns were rare and dangerous. They cared for the sick, taught children to read, served as banks and depositories for valuables. In short, they performed many of the functions that in our age are handled by schools, hospitals, libraries, hotels, and social service agencies. Picture a monastery of this era, perhaps in the 9th century, perhaps in what is now southern Germany or northern France. It sits on a hill overlooking a river valley, surrounded by fields and forests that the monks have laboriously cleared and cultivated over generations. The church, built of stone with a tall square tower, dominates the complex. Around it cluster other buildings, the dormitory where the monks sleep, the refectory where they eat, the chapter house where they meet for business, the scriptorium where manuscripts are copied, the library where books are stored, the infirmary for the sick, the guest house for travelers, barns and workshops and storehouses. Before dawn, a bell rings, calling the monks to matins, the first prayer service of the day. They file into the church in darkness, taking their places in the choir stalls, and begin to chant the psalms in Latin. The sound echoes from the stone walls, ancient words in an ancient tongue, the same words that have been chanted in this way for centuries, the same rhythm that structures every day, every week, every year. After matins comes lauds, then prime as the sun rises. Between the offices, the monks work. Some in the fields, some in the workshops, some in the scriptorium copying manuscripts. The work of copying is slow and painstaking. A scribe sits at his desk near a window, for the light is precious and must not be wasted. Before him is a piece of parchment, sheep or goat skin, carefully prepared, scraped, and stretched until it is smooth enough to write on. He has prepared his ink the night before, mixing gall nuts, iron salts, and gum arabic to produce a black liquid that will last for centuries. His pen is a quill, probably from a goose, sharpened to a fine point. He copies from an exemplar, another manuscript propped up beside his desk, forming each letter with care, checking and rechecking to ensure accuracy. A single manuscript of the Bible might require 200 animal skins and a year or more of labor. A complete set of the Church Fathers might take decades to produce. Yet this work was done, day after day, year after year, century after century, because these monks believed that preserving knowledge was a form of prayer, that copying the words of Scripture and the wisdom of the Fathers was serving God. Without their labor, most of classical and early Christian literature would have been lost forever. The Dark Ages, it turns out, were the very opposite of dark when it came to the preservation of learning. But preservation was not simply about copying texts mechanically. The monks also annotated, commented, cross-referenced, created indices and finding aids. They developed systems of abbreviation that allowed them to fit more text on expensive parchment. They experimented with different styles of lettering, eventually developing the beautiful Carolingian minuscule and later the Gothic scripts that would dominate medieval manuscripts. They illuminated their manuscripts with gold leaf and brilliant pigments made from crushed minerals and organic materials, ultramarine blue from lapis lazuli brought from Afghanistan, crimson red from cochineal insects, vivid green from verdigris. The Book of Kells, produced in Irish monasteries around the year 800, represents the pinnacle of this art. Its pages explode with color and intricate interlacing patterns, with fantastic beasts and geometric designs of mind-bending complexity, with portraits of the evangelists that manage to be simultaneously flat and three-dimensional, abstract and representational. Each page is a meditation, a prayer made visible, a demonstration that beauty can be an act of devotion. To say that the age that produced such work was dark is to misunderstand fundamentally what darkness means. Ireland itself deserves special attention in our story, for while the Roman Empire had encompassed most of Western Europe, it never conquered Ireland. The island remained outside imperial control, Celtic in language and culture, organized into small kingdoms ruled by local chieftains. But in the 5th century, a Romano-British Christian named Patrick was captured by Irish raiders and enslaved. After escaping and returning home, he felt called to return to Ireland as a missionary, and he spent the remainder of his life preaching Christianity to the Irish. The Christianity that took root in Ireland developed distinctive characteristics. Because Ireland had no cities and no Roman administrative structure, the church organized itself around monasteries rather than dioceses. These Irish monasteries became famous for their learning and their missionary zeal. Irish monks traveled to Scotland, to northern England, to Francia, to Switzerland, to Italy, founding new monasteries, preaching, teaching, copying manuscripts. They brought with them a fierce asceticism, a love of Latin learning, and an artistic tradition that fused Celtic and Christian motifs in ways that influenced European art for centuries. One of these Irish monks was Columba, who left Ireland in 563 with 12 companions and sailed to the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland. There he founded a monastery that became one of the great cultural centers of the early Middle Ages, a place where manuscripts were copied, where missionaries were trained, where kings came to be counseled and blessed. From Iona, monks spread Christianity to the Picts of Scotland and the Anglo-Saxons of Northumbria. The monk Aidan founded the monastery at Lindisfarne, which produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, another masterpiece of manuscript illumination. Another Irish monk was Columbanus, who traveled to Gaul around 590 and founded monasteries at Luxeuil and Fontaines before moving on to Switzerland and finally to Bobbio in Italy, where he died in 615. His rule for monks was stricter than Benedict's, emphasizing harsh discipline and severe penalties for infractions, but his learning was renowned, and his foundations became important centers of scholarship. Wherever the Irish went, they brought books, not just scriptural and liturgical texts but also classical works, histories, poetry, grammar, anything they had managed to preserve from the wreck of the classical world. This Irish contribution to European culture has led some historians to speak of an Irish Golden Age, a period when Ireland was a beacon of learning while the continent struggled with invasions and political fragmentation. There's truth to this claim, but it can be overstated. Ireland produced remarkable scholars and beautiful manuscripts, but it also remained politically fragmented, economically underdeveloped, frequently racked by warfare between rival kingdoms. It preserved learning, but it did not advance it in the way that later medieval universities would. Still, the Irish monks' contribution to maintaining continuity with the classical past, and to spreading Christianity and literacy across Northern Europe, cannot be overstated. While monks copied manuscripts and Irish missionaries preached, another great cultural transformation was underway that would have profound consequences for European history. This was the conversion of the Slavic peoples, the vast populations inhabiting Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans. The story of this conversion takes us to two brothers from Thessalonica, Constantine and Methodius, whom we remember as Cyril and Methodius. In 862, Prince Rastislav of Great Moravia requested that the Byzantine Emperor Michael III send missionaries who could teach his people in their own language rather than in Latin or Greek. Michael chose Constantine and Methodius, who were already known as learned men and skilled diplomats. But before they could teach in Slavonic, they needed to create a written form of the language. Constantine, using his knowledge of Greek and Hebrew scripts, developed what would become known as the Glagolitic alphabet, the ancestor of the Cyrillic script still used in Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Serbia, and other Slavic nations. This was an act of profound cultural importance. By creating a written language for the Slavs, Constantine and Methodius enabled them to develop a distinctively Slavic form of Christianity, one that preserved their linguistic and cultural identity while bringing them into the broader Christian world. They translated the Bible and the liturgy into Slavonic, allowing ordinary people to worship in their own tongue rather than in the incomprehensible Latin of the Western Church or Greek of the Eastern. The liturgical language question became entangled with the growing divide between Rome and Constantinople, between the Latin Church of the West and the Greek Church of the East. This divide had been widening for centuries, based on theological disagreements, political rivalries, cultural differences, and competing claims to authority. The final break, traditionally dated to 1054 when papal legates and the Patriarch of Constantinople mutually excommunicated each other, was really the culmination of a long process of estrangement. But already in the 9th century, when Cyril and Methodius were conducting their mission, the question of whether Slavic Christians would look to Rome or Constantinople for spiritual leadership had significant political implications. The Slavic peoples themselves would divide along this fault line. The Poles, Czechs, and Croats would join the Latin Church and adopt the Roman alphabet. The Russians, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, and Serbs would join the Greek Church and adopt the Cyrillic script. This division, rooted in decisions made in the supposedly dark centuries of the early Middle Ages, continues to shape European politics and culture to this day. Meanwhile, in the far north, another people were making their presence felt in European affairs. The Vikings, Norsemen, Northmen, Danes, Norwegians, whatever we call them, erupted from Scandinavia in the late 8th century, raiding, trading, and eventually settling across vast stretches of Europe. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 shocked Christendom and inaugurated what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Age of the Heathen. For the next 2 centuries, Viking longships would appear with terrifying suddenness on rivers and coasts from Ireland to the Mediterranean, from Iceland to the Caspian Sea. The Viking raids have often been portrayed as pure destruction, as one more evidence of the darkness of these centuries. And certainly, they caused immense suffering. Monasteries were favorite targets because they were wealthy, poorly defended, and located on coasts or rivers for easy access. The monks we've been celebrating for preserving learning had their books burned, their buildings sacked, their brothers killed or enslaved. The monastery at Iona was raided repeatedly and finally abandoned. Lindisfarne was devastated. Throughout Europe, litanies were amended to include a new petition, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." But the Viking phenomenon was far more complex than simple piracy and destruction. The Vikings were traders as well as raiders, explorers and settlers as well as warriors. Their ships, with their shallow draft and flexible construction, could navigate both the open ocean and shallow rivers, giving them access to trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea, Scandinavia to North America. They established trading posts that became great cities: Dublin, Kiev, Novgorod. They founded states that would endure for centuries: the Duchy of Normandy, the Kingdom of Sicily, the Kievan Rus that would become Russia. The Vikings were also master craftsmen, producing metalwork, wood carving, and textile arts of remarkable sophistication. Their ships were engineering marvels, built without nails by skilled shipwrights who had inherited centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to shape oak planks so they would flex with the waves rather than breaking, how to balance a vessel so it could sail in nearly any wind, how to make a craft that could be rowed by a crew when the wind failed and beached on any shore when harbor facilities were unavailable. One such ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway and now displayed in Oslo, gives us a glimpse of Viking artistry. The Osberg ship, built around 820 and used as a burial vessel for 2 women of high status, is 70 feet long, carved from oak, decorated with intricate designs of intertwined beasts and serpents. The burial chamber contained not just the ship but also sledges, beds, chests, tools, textiles, everything the dead would need in the afterlife according to Norse beliefs. These were not simple barbarians but people with complex spiritual beliefs, sophisticated social hierarchies, and refined aesthetic sensibilities. The Norse mythology that guided these beliefs was rich and complex, a pantheon of gods who were themselves mortal, destined to die at Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Odin, the All-Father, who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung himself on the world tree to learn the runes. Thor, the thunder god, who battled giants with his hammer Mjolnir. Freya, goddess of love and war, who claimed half the battle slain. Loki, the trickster, whose children included the world serpent and the wolf who would devour the sun. These myths were preserved in poetry and saga, memorized and recited by skalds, professional poets who composed in complex meters and used elaborate metaphors called kennings. When the Vikings began to settle in Christian lands, they encountered a faith that both attracted and puzzled them. Christianity offered hope of eternal life, powerful magic in its rituals, and useful political alliances with Christian kings. But it demanded exclusive loyalty, forbade the old gods, rejected traditional practices like exposing unwanted infants and feuding with one's enemies. The conversion process was gradual and often incomplete. Viking settlers might be baptized for political convenience but continue to worship Thor in private. Or they might hedge their bets, carrying both cross and hammer as amulets. In England, the Danish Viking leader Guthrum signed a peace treaty with King Alfred of Wessex in 878 that included his conversion to Christianity. Alfred stood as his godfather at his baptism, and the two kings established a boundary between English and Danish territory, the Danelaw, where Vikings could settle and live according to their own customs. Over several generations, the Viking settlers of the Danelaw adopted Christianity, learned English alongside their Norse tongue, and intermarried with the native population, creating a hybrid culture that enriched both traditions. Alfred himself deserves more than a passing mention. Known to history as Alfred the Great, the only English king to earn that epithet, he ruled Wessex from 871 to 899 and transformed it from a kingdom barely surviving Viking attacks into the strongest power in England. But his achievements were not just military. Alfred was a scholar who learned Latin as an adult, translated important works from Latin into English, commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to record his kingdom's history, established schools, reformed law codes, and patronized learning in ways that earned him comparison to Charlemagne. Alfred understood that a kingdom's strength rested not just on warriors but on justice, education, and administration. He saw that the Viking invasions had succeeded partly because the English kingdoms were divided and partly because their cultural infrastructure, the monasteries, schools, and legal traditions that had provided cohesion, had been badly damaged. So even while fighting the Vikings, he worked to rebuild that infrastructure, to create a kingdom where law was respected, where learning was valued, where the church was supported, where even common people could aspire to literacy in their own language. This brings us to a crucial point about the so-called Dark Ages. They were not uniform in either geography or chronology. While one region suffered invasion and political collapse, another might be experiencing relative peace and prosperity. While one century saw widespread disruption, the next might see recovery and growth. The 8th century, which saw the Carolingian Renaissance, was very different from the 6th, which saw plague, war, and population decline. The 10th century, which saw the establishment of new kingdoms and the beginnings of medieval urbanization, was very different from the 9th, which saw devastating Viking raids. The Great Plague of Justinian, which struck the Mediterranean world in the 540s and returned in waves over the next 2 centuries, probably killed a third to half of the population in affected regions. This was a catastrophe on the scale of the Black Death of the 14th century, and it had comparable effects on economic life, political structures, and cultural production. Population collapse meant abandoned farmland, depopulated cities, shrinking tax revenues, weakened armies. In this context, the preservation of learning and the maintenance of any political order at all was a remarkable achievement. But by the 9th and 10th centuries, population was recovering. New agricultural techniques were being adopted: the heavy plow that could turn the dense soils of northern Europe, the 3-field rotation system that improved yields, the horse collar that made horses practical for plowing. These seemingly minor innovations had major effects, supporting larger populations, generating agricultural surpluses that could sustain non-farming specialists like craftsmen and merchants, enabling the growth of towns and trade. In the 10th century, a network of fortified towns called boroughs was established in England, serving both defensive and commercial purposes. Markets sprang up where farmers could sell their surplus produce and buy manufactured goods. Guilds of craftsmen began to organize, setting standards for their trades and protecting their members' interests. Monasteries that had been raided and abandoned in the 9th century were refounded and reformed in the 10th, often with stricter rules and renewed dedication to learning and prayer. This same period saw the establishment of the great German kingdom that would become the Holy Roman Empire. Otto I, crowned emperor in 962, consciously modeled himself on Charlemagne, creating an empire that united Germany and Italy under a ruler who claimed authority from God and governed in cooperation with the Church. Otto patronized learning, founded cathedral schools, appointed bishops who were also administrators, and worked to extend Christianity to the pagan Slavs along his eastern frontier. The Ottonian Renaissance, as this period is sometimes called, produced remarkable achievements in art and architecture. The great Romanesque churches built during this era, with their massive walls, rounded arches, and barrel vaults, still stand throughout Europe, monuments to the architectural ambition and engineering skill of supposedly dark centuries. Inside these churches, frescoes and mosaics depicted biblical scenes and saints' lives, teaching the faith to largely illiterate congregations through images of great power and beauty. One of the most striking features of Ottonian art is its intensity and expressiveness. The figures in Ottonian manuscripts and metalwork have large, staring eyes, dramatic gestures, and emotional force. They're not trying to be realistic in the way classical Greek or Roman art was, but they're not primitive either. They're working in a different aesthetic tradition, one that valued spiritual truth over physical accuracy, symbolic meaning over naturalistic representation. To understand this art on its own terms rather than measuring it against classical standards is to begin to appreciate the sophistication of early medieval culture. The year 1000 approached with both anticipation and anxiety. Some Christians expected the end of the world, the return of Christ in judgment, the final reckoning of souls. This apocalyptic expectation has been exaggerated by later writers. Most learned Christians understood that no one could know the day or hour of Christ's return, but it did exist, and it colored how people thought about time and history. They saw themselves as living in the last days, the final age of the world before time itself would end. But the year 1000 came and went, and the world continued. Indeed, the 11th century would see dramatic changes that marked a clear transition from the early Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages, from a period of relative political fragmentation and economic contraction to one of growing political consolidation, economic expansion, and cultural flourishing. The darkness that later scholars would attribute to the entire period from the 5th to the 15th centuries was in fact lifting, if it had ever been as dark as they imagined. One of the most significant developments of the 11th century was the reform of the Church. For centuries, the Church had been deeply entangled with secular power. Bishops were appointed by kings and often functioned more as royal officials than spiritual leaders. Monasteries held vast estates and their abbots were wealthy landowners. Parish priests were frequently illiterate, ignorant of basic theology, and sometimes married despite clerical celibacy being the official rule. The Church's spiritual authority was compromised by its worldly wealth and political involvement. A movement for reform began at the monastery of Cluny, founded in 910 with a charter that placed it under the direct protection of the Pope, free from interference by local lords. Cluny became the head of a network of reformed monasteries across Europe, all following a strict interpretation of the Benedictine rule, emphasizing elaborate liturgy, strict discipline, and independence from secular control. The Cluniac reform spread beyond monasteries to influence the broader Church, creating pressure for higher standards of clerical education and morality. The Reform movement reached its peak under Pope Gregory VII, who served from 1073 to 1085. Gregory believed that the Church should be independent of secular control, that popes should have authority over kings in spiritual matters, that the Church should be free to elect its own bishops and abbots without royal interference. These claims brought him into direct conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, leading to a dramatic confrontation known as the Investiture Controversy. The crisis came to a head in 1077 when Henry, excommunicated by Gregory and facing rebellion from his nobles, traveled to Canossa in northern Italy where the Pope was staying. There, in the middle of winter, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging forgiveness. It was a moment of high drama, the most powerful secular ruler in Europe humbling himself before a pope. Gregory eventually lifted the excommunication, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. The struggle between church and state, between spiritual and temporal authority, would continue throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. This was not a conflict born of darkness or ignorance but rather of competing visions of how Christian society should be organized, of genuine debate about the proper relationship between different types of authority. The ability to conceive of and argue for institutional independence, to develop legal and theological arguments for limiting royal power, to imagine a social order based on principles rather than simply on force, these were sophisticated intellectual achievements, not evidence of primitiveness. The 11th century also saw the beginning of the Crusades, perhaps the most controversial aspect of medieval Christianity. In 1095, Pope Urban II preached at Clermont in France, calling on Christians to journey to the Holy Land to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of knights, common soldiers, and non-combatants took up the cross and journeyed eastward, motivated by faith, by desire for adventure, by hope of material gain, by penance for sins, by all the complex mix of motives that drive human action. The First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, but at a terrible cost. The Crusaders massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in an orgy of violence that shocked even the participants' contemporaries. They established Crusader states in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, that would survive for nearly 2 centuries, maintaining a precarious Christian presence in a predominantly Muslim region. The Crusades are often seen as quintessentially medieval, as evidence of the period's religious fanaticism and barbarism. But this judgment is too simple. The Crusades were indeed violent and often driven by base motives, but they were also complex international undertakings that required sophisticated organization, logistics, and diplomacy. They brought Western Europeans into contact with Byzantine and Islamic civilizations that were in many ways more advanced, exposing them to new ideas, technologies, and goods. The returning Crusaders brought back not just holy relics but also knowledge of mathematics, medicine, architecture, and philosophy that had been preserved and advanced in the Islamic world. Moreover, the Crusades cannot be understood in isolation from the broader context of Christian-Muslim relations in this period. Muslim forces had conquered Christian lands in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa in the 7th century. They had invaded Spain, Sicily, and southern France. From a Christian perspective, the Crusades were not unprovoked aggression but rather attempts to reclaim lost territories and protect Christian communities living under Muslim rule. From a Muslim perspective, they were invasions by foreign barbarians. Both perspectives have validity, and the reality was more complex than either simple narrative allows. In Spain, Christians and Muslims had been fighting for centuries in what Spanish Christians called the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim control. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered most of Spain in the 8th century, but Christian kingdoms survived in the north and gradually expanded southward over the following centuries. By the 11th century, the Caliphate had fragmented into small kingdoms called taifas, making them vulnerable to Christian military pressure. But this was not simply a conflict between two monolithic religious blocs. Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side in medieval Spain, sometimes fighting, sometimes trading, sometimes collaborating. Kings of different faiths allied with each other against co-religionists. Christian knights fought for Muslim lords and vice versa. Scholars of all three faiths studied together, translated texts from Arabic to Latin, from Hebrew to Romance languages. The result was a rich cultural synthesis that preserved and transmitted ancient knowledge while creating something genuinely new. Toledo, conquered by Christian forces in 1085, became a center of translation where Arabic texts were rendered into Latin, making available to Western Europeans works of Greek philosophy, Islamic science and medicine, and Jewish theology and mysticism that had been unknown or forgotten. Through Toledo and other Spanish centers, Aristotle's works returned to Western Europe after an absence of centuries, bringing with them the commentaries of Arab philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna. This influx of New Old knowledge would transform European intellectual life in the 12th and 13th centuries, leading to the founding of universities and the rise of scholastic philosophy. The universities themselves were a distinctly medieval creation, emerging in the 12th century as guilds of students and masters seeking corporate independence and standardized education. Bologna, famous for legal studies, claimed to be the oldest, founded around 1088. Paris, which became the center of theological and philosophical studies, emerged from cathedral schools in the mid-12th century. Oxford and Cambridge followed soon after. These institutions were not monasteries or cathedral schools but something new, self-governing corporations of scholars who studied, debated, lectured, and examined each other according to their own standards. The curriculum they taught was based on ancient models but adapted to medieval needs. Students began with the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, that formed the foundation of classical education. Those who completed this bachelor's degree could then pursue advanced study in law, medicine, or theology. The teaching method, called scholasticism, emphasized careful reading of authoritative texts, dialectical reasoning to resolve apparent contradictions, and formal disputation where students defended theses against objections. It was intellectually rigorous, often pedantic, sometimes sterile, but it produced minds trained in analytical thinking and logical argumentation. Thomas Aquinas, studying and teaching in Paris in the 13th century, represents the scholastic method at its best. He sought to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, reason with faith, classical learning with biblical revelation. His Summa Theologica, an enormous work of systematic theology, addresses thousands of questions using a consistent method. State the question, present objections to the position being defended, give arguments for that position, then respond to each objection in turn. It's methodical, comprehensive, sometimes exhausting in its detail, but also brilliantly systematic and logically rigorous. To read Aquinas is to encounter a mind of extraordinary power working in a tradition that valued clarity, precision, and rational argument. This was the intellectual culture of what historians call the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through 13th centuries. It was built on foundations laid during the supposedly dark centuries we've been exploring: the Carolingian educational reforms, the monastic preservation of texts, the cathedral schools that trained the clergy. Without those earlier centuries of preservation and gradual development, the achievements of the High Middle Ages would have been impossible. The darkness was necessary for the light that followed, or rather, there was no darkness at all, only a long period of transformation during which new forms of culture and learning were slowly taking shape. But what about technology? Surely the Dark Ages, if they deserve the name, must have been a period of technological regression, when the sophisticated engineering of Rome gave way to crude primitiveness. This too turns out to be largely false. While some Roman technologies were lost, the recipe for concrete, the techniques for building certain types of roads and aqueducts, others were preserved and improved. And entirely new technologies were developed that would eventually surpass anything the Romans had achieved. Consider the watermill, known to the Romans but rarely used by them because slave labor was cheaper than building and maintaining machinery. In the Middle Ages, with labor scarcer and more expensive, watermills proliferated throughout Europe, grinding grain, fulling cloth, sawing wood, hammering metal. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's survey of England in 1086, records over 6,000 mills in a country of perhaps 2 million people, 1 mill for every 300 inhabitants. This represents a significant investment of capital and engineering skill, and it provided mechanical power on a scale the Romans never achieved. The heavy plow, developed in Northern Europe during the early Middle Ages, made it possible to cultivate the heavy, wet soils that the Roman scratch plow could not handle effectively. This opened up vast areas of Northern Europe to productive agriculture, supporting population growth and urbanization. The horse collar, another medieval innovation, allowed horses to be used for plowing and hauling without choking, making them practical alternatives to slower oxen for many tasks. The stirrup, introduced to Western Europe from Central Asia in the 8th century, revolutionized cavalry warfare by making it possible for a mounted warrior to use the weight and momentum of his horse in combat without being unseated. This contributed to the rise of heavy cavalry as the dominant military force of the Middle Ages and to the development of feudalism as a system for maintaining that expensive military force. Again, this was not a simple borrowing but an adaptation and improvement of an existing technology to meet specific needs and conditions. In architecture, the Romans had mastered the rounded arch and the dome, creating structures like the Pantheon that remain engineering marvels. But medieval builders, working within different constraints and toward different goals, developed the pointed arch and the ribbed vault, which distributed weight more efficiently and allowed for taller, lighter structures with larger windows. The result was Gothic architecture, those soaring cathedrals that seemed to defy gravity, their walls almost entirely replaced by stained glass that filled the interior with colored light. The Gothic cathedrals represent not just technical achievement but also social organization on a massive scale. Notre Dame de Paris took nearly 2 centuries to complete. Chartres was built in just 26 years after a fire destroyed the earlier church, but this required mobilizing the resources of an entire region, coordinating the efforts of hundreds of craftsmen, solving engineering problems that no one had previously encountered. These buildings were conscious statements of faith and civic pride, monuments that declared their builders' confidence in their civilization's permanence and divine favor. Inside these cathedrals, stained glass windows depicted biblical stories, saints' lives, moral lessons, and visions of divine glory. These were books for the illiterate, teaching through images what most parishioners could not read in text. But they were more than simple visual aids. They were art of extraordinary sophistication, using light and color to create effects that moved viewers emotionally and spiritually. The blue glass of Chartres, whose exact recipe has never been duplicated, glows with an otherworldly radiance. The rose windows of Notre Dame transform sunlight into cascades of colored luminescence that fill the cavernous interior. To stand in one of these spaces is to experience what medieval Christians meant when they spoke of God as light. The period's artistic achievements extended far beyond church architecture. Manuscript illumination reached new heights in the 13th and 14th centuries with books of hours, personal prayer books for wealthy laypeople, that contained calendar illustrations showing activities associated with each month, prayers for different times of day, scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary, all rendered in brilliant colors and gold leaf with astonishing detail and refinement. Secular literature also flourished. The Song of Roland, composed in the late 11th century, recounted in French verse the heroic death of Charlemagne's nephew fighting the Saracens in Spain. The Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes, written in the late 12th century, established many of the elements of the King Arthur legend that endure today: the Round Table, Lancelot's love for Guinevere, the quest for the Holy Grail. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed in the early 14th century, took readers on a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, encountering historical figures and contemporary politicians, ancient philosophers, and Christian saints, all rendered in Italian verse of unsurpassed beauty and power. These works were not written in Latin, the language of learning and the church, but in vernacular languages: French, Italian, German, English. This represents a significant democratization of culture, an acknowledgement that sophisticated literature could be created and appreciated in languages ordinary people actually spoke. The fact that most people couldn't read even their own language doesn't diminish this achievement. The works were meant to be recited or read aloud, experienced communally rather than privately, and they were shaped by oral traditions as much as by written ones. Music too was developing in new directions. The plain chant that had structured Christian worship for centuries, monophonic, unaccompanied singing of prescribed melodies, began to be elaborated with additional melodic lines, creating polyphony. At first these additional voices simply tracked the main melody at fixed intervals, but gradually composers learned to create independent melodic lines that wove together in increasingly complex ways. By the 14th century, composers like Guillaume de Machaut were writing music of considerable sophistication, with multiple independent voices, complex rhythms, and carefully planned harmonic progressions. The notation used to write down this music was itself a significant innovation. Early medieval musical notation, called neumes, simply indicated whether the melody went up or down, serving as a memory aid for singers who already knew the tunes. But around the year 1000, Guido of Arezzo developed a staff system that showed not just melodic direction but specific pitches, making it possible to write down melodies that singers didn't already know and to create music of greater complexity and precision. This was as significant an innovation in its sphere as the development of written language itself had been centuries earlier. Let us turn now to the question of why the Dark Ages narrative persisted for so long despite evidence to the contrary. Part of the answer lies in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Protestant reformers, seeking to justify their break with Rome, portrayed the medieval church as corrupt, superstitious, and oppressive, a falling away from early Christian purity that required reformation. In this narrative, the Middle Ages became a long period of ecclesiastical tyranny from which the Reformation liberated Europe. The darkness was theological rather than intellectual, but it colored the entire period. The Enlightenment of the 18th century reinforced this negative view from a different angle. Enlightenment thinkers, celebrating reason, science, and progress, saw the Middle Ages as a time when religious faith stifled rational inquiry, when superstition triumphed over science, when the Church's authority prevented free thought. Voltaire spoke mockingly of the medieval period, Edward Gibbon blamed Christianity for Rome's decline, and both helped establish the view that only with the decline of church power and the rise of secular learning could true progress resume. The Romantic movement of the 19th century offered a more sympathetic view of the Middle Ages, celebrating medieval art, literature, and architecture, admiring chivalry and courtly love, seeing in Gothic cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts a spiritual authenticity that industrial modernity lacked. But even this positive re-evaluation accepted the basic premise that the Middle Ages were fundamentally different from both classical antiquity and modern times, set apart by their religious character and pre-scientific worldview. Modern medieval scholarship has largely rejected the concept of the Dark Ages as more misleading than helpful. Historians now speak of late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and the High Middle Ages, recognizing that these were periods of change and development, not of stagnation or regression. They acknowledge that certain types of knowledge and certain technologies were lost with Rome's transformation, but they also recognize that new forms of knowledge and new technologies emerged. They see continuity as well as change, preservation as well as innovation. The transformation of the Roman world was not a simple decline but a complex process of adaptation to changing circumstances. When the centralized imperial government weakened, other institutions, the church, the monastery, the local lord, stepped in to provide social services and maintain order. When long-distance trade contracted due to warfare and political instability, local and regional economic networks became more important. When urban populations declined, rural estates became the primary centers of production and power. These were not failures but adaptations, not dark ages but different ages, organized according to different principles, pursuing different goals. Consider the question of literacy, often cited as evidence of the Dark Ages' darkness. It's true that fewer people could read in the year 800 than in the year 400, that literacy was largely confined to the clergy and a small number of lay aristocrats. But this represents not a simple loss but a shift in what literacy meant and who needed it. In the Roman Empire, literacy had been essential for administration, commerce, and legal affairs, and many merchants, craftsmen, and officials needed at least basic reading and writing skills. In the early medieval world, with its more localized economy and less bureaucratic administration, fewer people needed literacy for their daily work. But the literate minority, mostly monks and clerics, maintained remarkably high standards. They copied and studied texts in Latin and sometimes Greek, mastered complex theological and philosophical arguments, wrote histories and saints' lives and biblical commentaries. The literacy rate was lower, but the quality of literate culture among those who participated in it was not necessarily inferior to that of Rome. Moreover, oral culture flourished in ways that purely literate societies might struggle to achieve. Epic poems like Beowulf were composed and transmitted orally for generations before being written down. Professional reciters memorized thousands of lines of verse, performing with variations and embellishments for different audiences. Laws were recited publicly so that even the illiterate could know their rights and obligations. Contracts were sealed with symbolic acts, breaking a straw, shaking hands, that served the same function as written documents in a culture where most people couldn't read. This oral culture was not primitive but sophisticated in its own way, requiring different skills than literacy, prodigious memory, ability to improvise within traditional formulas, sensitivity to rhythm and sound. When it eventually encountered and merged with written culture, as happened increasingly from the Carolingian period onward, the result was not the simple replacement of oral by literate forms but a hybrid culture that combined elements of both, that valued both the fluidity of oral performance and the fixity of written text. The question of violence deserves consideration too. The early Middle Ages were indeed violent, characterized by endemic warfare, blood feuds, brutal punishments, and casual cruelty. But was this really darker than the Roman Empire, with its gladiatorial games, its mass enslavements, its crucifixions, its wars of conquest that killed millions? Or darker than our own 20th century, with its world wars, genocides, and totalitarian terrors? Violence is a constant of human history, but its forms change. Medieval violence was more personal and visible, less organized and bureaucratic, than modern violence, but not necessarily worse in degree or effect. Indeed, the medieval church worked consistently to limit violence, establishing concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God that prohibited fighting on holy days, protected non-combatants, and established sanctuaries where even criminals could not be harmed. These efforts were not always successful, but they represented serious attempts to impose moral limits on warfare and to establish the principle that violence should be regulated by law and custom rather than being simply a matter of might making right. The development of chivalry, the code of conduct for knights, also represented an attempt to tame violence by binding it to honor, loyalty, and service. A knight was supposed to be brave but also merciful, strong but also gentle to the weak, fierce to enemies but courteous to friends and ladies. These ideals were often honored more in the breach than the observance, but the fact that they existed at all, that warriors felt pressured to live up to moral standards rather than simply following their own violent impulses, represents a significant civilizational achievement. Let us consider now the matter of women's lives during these centuries, for the treatment of women is often cited as another proof of medieval darkness. It's certainly true that medieval Europe was patriarchal, that women had fewer legal rights than men, that their lives were constrained by expectations of marriage and motherhood, that their opportunities for education and independent action were limited. But again, the reality was more complex than simple oppression. Women could inherit and own property, especially widows who had come into their husbands' estates. Royal and noble women often wielded considerable political power, ruling as regents for underage sons, managing estates while their husbands were at war, negotiating marriage alliances that shaped international politics. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived in the 12th century, was duchess in her own right of the richest province in France, was queen consort of first France and then England, led a crusade, patronized poets and artists, and was a major political player for more than half a century. Women also found opportunities in the church. Monasteries for women, though fewer than those for men, provided spaces where women could be educated, exercise authority, and pursue intellectual and spiritual goals outside the constraints of marriage. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century abbess, wrote theological works, composed music, studied medicine and natural science, corresponded with popes and emperors, and experienced mystical visions that she recorded in illuminated manuscripts. She wielded moral authority that made even powerful men hesitate to cross her. The cult of the Virgin Mary, which reached its height in the High Middle Ages, elevated feminine ideals of purity, mercy, and compassion to the center of Christian devotion. Mary was portrayed as the Queen of Heaven, the intercessor who could move even God himself to mercy, the mother who understood human suffering and offered comfort. This Marian devotion could coexist with misogyny, and often did, but it also provided a theological basis for valuing feminine qualities and for seeing women as capable of spiritual greatness. Still, we should not romanticize women's position in medieval society. Most women's lives were hard, constrained, and shaped by childbirth's dangers and demands. But most men's lives were also hard, shaped by warfare's dangers and agricultural labor's demands. Life was difficult for everyone except the tiny elite of kings, great nobles, and high churchmen, and even they faced violence, disease, and early death at rates that would shock modern sensibilities. The question of disease brings us to another crucial point. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, killed perhaps a third of the continent's population in just a few years. This was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, and its effects, economic, social, cultural, psychological, were profound and lasting. But the Black Death came at the end of the period we're discussing, and if anything, it helps put earlier centuries in perspective. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century had comparable effects, yet society recovered, adapted, and eventually rebuilt. Human resilience in the face of catastrophe, not simply vulnerability to it, is one of the themes that emerges from studying these centuries. Medieval medicine, often mocked as superstitious and ineffective, was actually a blend of ancient theory, practical experience, and religious faith. It was based on the humoral theory inherited from Greek physicians like Galen, the idea that health depended on balancing four bodily humors, which was wrong in its specifics but provided a conceptual framework for thinking about disease and treatment. Medieval physicians learned anatomy, though they had limited opportunities for dissection. They studied medicinal plants and minerals, accumulating practical knowledge about what remedies worked for what ailments. They performed surgeries, set bones, treated wounds. Were their treatments effective? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Just as with modern medicine, though the ratio of success to failure was certainly lower. But the point is not to defend medieval medicine as equal to modern medicine, obviously it wasn't, but rather to recognize that it was a serious intellectual discipline practiced by educated professionals who combined theoretical learning with practical experience, not simply quackery and superstition as it's sometimes portrayed. The monasteries played a crucial role in medical care, maintaining infirmaries where monks who fell ill were treated and hospitalities where pilgrims and travelers could rest and recover. They cultivated herb gardens for medicinal plants and copied medical manuscripts just as they copied biblical and classical texts. Some monasteries became famous for their healing expertise, attracting patients from miles around. This was charity, certainly, but it was also a form of practical knowledge preservation and development. Hospitals as distinct institutions, separate from monasteries, dedicated specifically to caring for the sick poor, emerged in medieval cities from the 12th century onward. These were funded by private charity, by guilds, by municipal governments. They employed physicians and surgeons, maintained pharmacies, and provided long-term care for the chronically ill and disabled. They were not hospitals in our modern sense, their facilities were primitive, their ability to cure limited, their mortality rates high. But they represented a social commitment to caring for the vulnerable that deserves recognition. The medieval economy, too, has been misunderstood and undervalued. The early Middle Ages did see a contraction of long-distance trade and urban life compared to the Roman period, but by the 10th and 11th centuries, commerce was reviving and towns were growing. Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa built trading empires that stretched across the Mediterranean. Merchants from the German Hansa cities dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas. Champagne, in France, hosted great fairs where merchants from across Europe met to exchange goods and settle accounts. This commercial revival was based on several factors. Agricultural improvements increased food production, creating surpluses that could feed urban populations. Better security on roads and seas made trade less dangerous. The development of new financial instruments, bills of exchange, letters of credit, partnerships, made it easier to conduct business across long distances. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen organized production and established quality standards. All of this required literacy, numeracy, legal sophistication, and economic rationality, hardly evidence of a dark age. The growth of towns created new social spaces and new opportunities. A German proverb held that town air makes free. A serf who escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day could not be reclaimed by his former lord. Towns offered markets for agricultural produce, employment for craftsmen, education for the ambitious. They developed forms of self-government, with elected officials and written charters defining their rights and obligations. The urban culture that emerged in medieval towns, commercial, literate, relatively secular, focused on practical affairs rather than theology or warfare, would eventually transform European society, but its roots lay in these supposedly dark centuries. Consider a medieval town around the year 1200. It's surrounded by walls for defense, with gates that are closed at night and opened in the morning. Inside, narrow streets wind between houses built of timber and plaster or, in wealthier towns, of stone. The streets are unpaved, muddy in wet weather, dusty and dry, and they serve as open sewers, though ordinances require householders to keep the frontage of their properties clean. The air smells of wood smoke, cooking food, human and animal waste, the various crafts being practiced, tanning leather, brewing beer, baking bread, working metal. In the market square, farmers from the surrounding countryside sell produce from stalls and carts, grain, vegetables, eggs, cheese, live chickens and geese. Craftsmen sell their wares, pots, tools, cloth, shoes, knives. A fishmonger displays his catch, shouting to attract customers. A baker's shop sends out the aroma of fresh bread. An alehouse offers rest and refreshment to travelers and workers. Money changes hands. Silver pennies, the basic currency, along with foreign coins from distant cities, all carefully weighed and tested for purity by suspicious merchants. The town's church, usually the largest and finest building, stands prominently, its bells marking the hours of prayer and summoning the faithful to Massachusetts. Near the church is the town hall, where the council of prominent citizens meets to make decisions about markets, defenses, taxation, and justice. The guild hall of the merchant guild might be nearby, or the halls of various craft guilds, weavers, smiths, butchers, each with its own regulations and internal hierarchy. This is not a modern city. It's smaller, dirtier, more dangerous, more constrained by tradition and authority. But it's also not a primitive village. It's a complex social organism with multiple institutions, diverse economic activities, written records, legal systems, educational facilities, and cultural production. To walk through such a town is to recognize that the people who lived here were not fumbling in darkness but actively building a civilization that would eventually give rise to our own. The intellectual life of these towns increasingly centered on schools that were separate from monasteries and cathedrals. Bologna's law school attracted students from across Europe who came to study Roman law, which was being rediscovered and systematically analyzed for the first time in centuries. Paris's schools, which would eventually coalesce into a university, focused on theology and philosophy, particularly the newly available works of Aristotle. Oxford and Cambridge developed as centers of learning independent of both church and state, governed by their own masters and enjoying special privileges granted by royal charter. Students at these universities lived together in nations, groups organized by geographic origin, and later in colleges, endowed institutions that provided housing and support. They studied together, debated together, drank and caroused together, and frequently clashed with townspeople who resented their special legal status. University students were a rowdy lot, much given to drinking, gambling, and fighting, but they were also serious scholars who spent years mastering Latin, logic, and the authoritative texts of their disciplines. The teaching was conducted in Latin, the international language of learning, which meant that a student from Portugal could study in Paris or Prague or Oxford and understand the lectures. The textbooks were manuscripts, laboriously copied by hand or purchased from commercial scriptoria that had emerged to meet the growing demand. The teaching method was disputatio, formal debate, where students learned to defend positions against objections, to distinguish between different types of arguments, to construct logical proofs and identify logical fallacies. This scholastic method has been much criticized for its rigidity and its reliance on authority rather than observation, for its tendency to split hairs and multiply distinctions to the point of absurdity. The stereotypical scholastic question, "How many angels can dance on the head of a pin?" was never actually debated but captures the sense that scholastics were more interested in logical puzzles than in understanding the real world. There's some justice to this criticism. Scholasticism at its worst could be sterile and disconnected from reality. But at its best, scholastic philosophy represented a serious attempt to reconcile faith and reason, to demonstrate that Christian theology was intellectually coherent and philosophically defensible, to preserve and build upon the classical inheritance while adapting it to Christian purposes. Thomas Aquinas, whom we mentioned earlier, built a comprehensive philosophical system that integrated Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, showing how reason and revelation could complement rather than contradict each other. His work influenced not just medieval theology but the development of Western philosophy for centuries afterward. Nor were scholastics uninterested in the natural world. Albertus Magnus, Aquinas' teacher, wrote extensively on natural science, studying plants, animals, and minerals with careful observation and classification. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar who taught at Oxford in the 13th century, advocated for empirical methods in natural philosophy, conducted experiments in optics, and envisioned flying machines and powered ships centuries before they became practical realities. Robert Grosseteste, another Oxford scholar, studied light and developed mathematical approaches to physics that anticipated later scientific methods. These men worked within a framework that saw nature as God's creation and therefore as worthy of study, believing that understanding the natural world was a way of understanding God's wisdom. This theological motivation for studying nature would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution, though that development was still centuries away. But the point is that medieval thinkers were not indifferent to nature or hostile to careful observation and logical analysis of natural phenomena. They were building, within their own conceptual framework, a tradition of natural philosophy that our modern science would eventually grow from. The technological innovations of the later Middle Ages further demonstrate that this was not a period of stagnation. Mechanical clocks, which appeared in the 14th century, were marvels of precision engineering that transformed how people thought about time. No longer was time measured by the sun's position or the length of candles, but by the regular ticking of mechanisms that could divide the day into equal hours regardless of season. This revolution in timekeeping both reflected and enabled the increasingly organized, regulated character of urban commercial life. Eyeglasses, invented in Italy in the late 13th century, extended the working lives of scribes, craftsmen, and scholars whose vision had begun to fail. This seemingly simple innovation had profound effects, making it possible for people to continue productive work well into old age, preserving their accumulated knowledge and skill for society's benefit. The ability to see clearly, to read small text and do fine work, was suddenly something that could be restored technologically rather than being lost inevitably to age. The invention of the compass, or rather its adoption from China and improvement in Europe, made navigation safer and more reliable. Ships could now sail out of sight of land with confidence, opening up new trade routes and beginning the age of oceanic exploration. The magnetic compass, combined with improvements in ship design and navigation techniques, made possible the voyages that would eventually connect Europe with the Americas, Africa, and Asia in ways that transformed world history. Gunpowder, also adopted from China, began to appear in European warfare in the 14th century. Its early use was limited. The guns were unreliable, dangerous to their operators, and not particularly effective compared to traditional weapons. But the principle was established, and over the following centuries, gunpowder weapons would revolutionize warfare, undermining the military dominance of armored knights and castle walls, shifting power toward those who could afford to manufacture and deploy artillery and handguns. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, is often seen as marking the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of modernity. But it was based on technologies and techniques developed during the medieval period: paper manufacture, metalworking, oil-based inks, screw presses. And it emerged from a culture that valued books, that had created a market for texts, that had developed standardized scripts and systematic approaches to textual scholarship. The printing press was revolutionary in its effects, but it grew organically from medieval foundations. All of these innovations, and many others we haven't mentioned, demonstrate that the medieval period was technologically dynamic, not static. Medieval people did not simply preserve and transmit ancient knowledge, they added to it, adapted it, transformed it to meet their needs and circumstances. They were not primitives struggling to maintain a degraded version of Roman civilization, but creative people solving problems, pursuing opportunities, and building new forms of social organization and cultural expression. The political developments of the later Middle Ages also deserve our attention. The emergence of representative institutions, parliaments, estates general, cortes, represented significant steps toward limiting monarchical power and giving subjects a voice in governance. These bodies began as advisory councils of nobles and clergy, but they gradually acquired real power over taxation and legislation. The principle that the king could not simply impose his will but must consult with representatives of his subjects, that taxation required consent, that law should be made through deliberation rather than royal fiat, these were medieval innovations that would eventually develop into modern constitutional government. The Magna Carta, forced on King John of England by his rebellious barons in 1215, is perhaps the most famous of these documents limiting royal power. Much of it dealt with specific feudal disputes of interest only to the barons themselves, but some clauses established principles of lasting importance, that no freeman could be imprisoned or punished except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, that justice should not be sold or delayed or denied. These principles were repeatedly violated in practice, but they existed as ideals to which people could appeal, as standards by which kings could be judged. The development of common law in England, built up case by case through judicial decisions rather than codified in comprehensive legal texts, created a flexible legal system that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity with the past. Judges' decisions in specific cases became precedents that guided future decisions, creating a body of law that was both consistent and evolutionary. This common law tradition, exported to English colonies around the world, remains one of medieval England's most important legacies. On the continent, the rediscovery of Roman law led to different but equally significant developments. Roman law was systematic, logical, written, very different from the customary law that had governed most medieval disputes. Its study produced legal professionals, lawyers, and judges who saw law as a specialized discipline requiring years of training. It contributed to the growth of royal power by providing theoretical foundations for centralized authority and bureaucratic administration. But it also established law as something separate from the ruler's personal will, as a set of principles that even kings should obey. The tension between royal authority and legal limitation, between the king's claim to rule by divine right and his subjects' insistence on their traditional rights and liberties, would shape European political development for centuries. This was not a tension between darkness and light but between different visions of political order, both of which had medieval roots. The absolute monarchies of early modern Europe and the constitutional monarchies and republics that eventually replaced them both grew from medieval precedents. Let us consider now the question of religious life, for religion permeated medieval society in ways that modern secular societies find difficult to comprehend. The church was not simply one institution among many but the framework within which all of life was understood. Time itself was structured by the church calendar, the liturgical year with its cycle of festivals, the weekly rhythm of Sunday worship, the daily offices that divided each day into hours of prayer. Space too was structured by the church. Every village had its church, every region its cathedral, every landscape its monasteries, shrines, and holy wells. But this religious saturation did not mean uniformity of belief or practice. Popular religion, the faith of ordinary peasants and townspeople, was quite different from the theology elaborated by scholars in universities. It was more concrete, more focused on the immediate and practical. Praying to particular saints for help with specific problems, venerating relics believed to work miracles, making pilgrimages to holy sites seeking healing or forgiveness, participating in religious processions and festivals that blended Christian and pre-Christian elements. The church hierarchy often struggled to control and reform popular religion, to eliminate what they saw as superstitious beliefs and practices, to educate the laity in proper doctrine. But this was an ongoing process, never fully successful, and in some ways the tension between official and popular religion was creative, generating new forms of devotion and new religious movements. One such movement was the development of mysticism, the pursuit of direct, experiential knowledge of God through contemplation and prayer. Mystics like Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, Meister Eckhart in the 14th, and Julian of Norwich in the 14th and 15th wrote about their experiences in language that was often paradoxical and poetic, trying to express in words what they insisted transcended words. They spoke of union with God, of being absorbed into the divine, of experiencing love that surpassed human understanding. This mystical tradition coexisted with scholastic theology, offering an alternative path to religious knowledge that emphasized experience over reason, feeling over logic. Some mystics were suspected of heresy for their claims to direct communion with God that bypassed the Church's sacramental system. But others were recognized as saints, their writings copied and circulated, their example inspiring generations of religious seekers. The development of new religious orders also shows the dynamism of medieval religious life. The Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi in the early 13th century, embraced radical poverty in imitation of Christ, begging for their food and owning no property even communally. They worked among the urban poor rather than withdrawing to rural monasteries, preaching in the streets, caring for lepers and outcasts. Francis himself, who reportedly received the stigmata, wounds matching those of the crucified Christ, became one of the most beloved saints in Christian history, admired for his humility, his joy, and his love for all of God's creation. The Dominicans, founded about the same time, focused on preaching and education, establishing houses in university towns and producing many of the age's greatest scholars. They were entrusted with the Inquisition, the Church's effort to identify and suppress heresy, which gives them a darker reputation. But they also produced Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, and many other thinkers who advanced medieval theology and philosophy. These new orders, called mendicant because they begged for their living, represented a significant shift in monastic ideals. The Benedictine monks had withdrawn from the world to create communities of prayer and work. The mendicant friars engaged with the world, particularly with the growing towns and their spiritual needs. This shift reflected broader social changes: urbanization, commercialization, increasing literacy, and education among laypeople that the Church had to address. The late medieval period also saw increasing criticism of the Church from within. Reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia questioned papal authority, challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation, advocated for translating the Bible into vernacular languages so ordinary people could read it themselves, and criticized the wealth and worldliness of the church hierarchy. These proto-Protestant movements were suppressed. Hus was burned at the stake in 1415, but the issues they raised would not go away, and they would eventually erupt in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. But this brings us to the end of our period. By the 15th century, the world was changing in ways that would make the Middle Ages seem increasingly distant. The Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire that had preserved Roman traditions for 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. Portuguese explorers were pushing down the African coast, beginning the age of European overseas expansion. Gutenberg's printing press was producing books more cheaply and quickly than ever before, making knowledge accessible to unprecedented numbers of people. Italian artists and scholars were proclaiming a renaissance, a rebirth of classical learning and artistic achievement after centuries of darkness. But as we've seen, that darkness was largely imaginary. The centuries between Rome's transformation and the Renaissance were not a void, not a gap in human history, not a period when civilization went to sleep. They were times of genuine achievement, of cultural creativity, of technological innovation, of intellectual development. They saw the emergence of new languages and literatures, new forms of art and architecture, new political institutions, new ways of thinking about law, nature, time, and space. Yes, there was violence, ignorance, suffering, and injustice, but these are constants of human history, not unique to the Middle Ages. And alongside them were courage, learning, compassion, and creativity. The monks copying manuscripts in their scriptoria, the architects designing cathedrals, the merchants organizing trade networks, the scholars debating philosophy, the mystics seeking God, the craftsmen perfecting their skills, the farmers improving their techniques, the kings establishing laws, the artists creating beauty. All these people were building, preserving, adapting, creating. They were not waiting for the Renaissance to rescue them from darkness, but living full human lives in societies that were complex, dynamic, and in many ways sophisticated. The term Dark Ages persists because narratives, once established, are hard to dislodge. The story of decline and fall, of catastrophic loss followed by slow recovery, is dramatic and compelling. It flatters later ages by contrast and provides a neat structure for organizing historical complexity. But it doesn't fit the evidence. The transformation of the Roman world was not a simple decline but a complex process of adaptation and reorganization. The early Middle Ages were not dark but different, organized according to different principles, pursuing different goals. If we must characterize these centuries, we might better call them the Age of Transition, when classical civilization metamorphosed into something new, when Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic cultures fused with Roman and Christian traditions to create the distinctively European civilization that would eventually spread across the globe. Or we might call them the Age of Foundations, when the institutions, technologies, and cultural forms that would define later European history were slowly taking shape. Or perhaps the Age of Preservation, when monks and scholars kept alive the learning of antiquity, copied and studied ancient texts, transmitted that knowledge to future generations who would build upon it. Or perhaps we should simply call them by their proper name, the Early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, Late Antiquity, recognizing that each age has its own character, its own achievements and failures, its own ways of organizing human life and making sense of human experience. These ages were not preparation for some later flowering, not simply laying groundwork for future achievement. They were times when people lived real lives, faced real challenges, experienced real joys and sorrows, and left legacies that shape our world to this day. When we look at a medieval cathedral, we're seeing not just a building but the accumulated skill of generations of craftsmen, the wealth of communities who chose to invest in these monuments, the faith that inspired such devotion, the engineering knowledge that made such structures possible. When we read a medieval manuscript, we're encountering not just a text but the labor of scribes who copied it, the artists who illuminated it, the libraries that preserved it, the scholars who studied it. When we study medieval law, philosophy, or literature, we're engaging with traditions that have been continuously developed and refined over centuries, that connect us to a living past. The Middle Ages were not perfect, no age is. They were not entirely admirable, no age is. They were marked by inequality, violence, and suffering, as all ages are. But they were not dark. They were filled with human beings striving to understand their world, to create beauty, to build just societies, to reach toward the divine, to leave the world better than they found it. In this, they were no different from any other age, including our own. As we've journeyed through these centuries together, we've encountered kings and peasants, monks and merchants, warriors and scholars, artists and craftsmen. We've walked through monasteries and cathedrals, market squares and palace halls. We've watched empires fall and new kingdoms rise, seen cities burn and be rebuilt, observed traditions die and new customs emerge. We've traced the transmission of knowledge across centuries and continents, followed the development of technologies and institutions, witnessed the slow transformation of languages, laws, and beliefs. What we've found is not darkness but complexity. Not decline but change. Not loss but transformation. The Roman world did not simply disappear, leaving only ruins and memories. It changed, adapted, evolved into something new. Classical learning was not lost but preserved, studied, and eventually transmitted to later generations who built upon it. Christianity did not extinguish the light of reason but created new contexts and motivations for intellectual inquiry. The supposedly barbaric Germanic peoples did not destroy civilization but created new forms of it, blending their traditions with those of Rome and Christianity to produce the rich cultural tapestry of medieval Europe. The great irony of the Dark Ages label is that these centuries preserved the very classical learning that Renaissance scholars so admired. Without Carolingian monks copying Roman texts, without medieval translators rendering Greek philosophy from Arabic into Latin, without scholastic philosophers wrestling with Aristotle and Plato, the Renaissance itself would have been impossible. The light of classical antiquity shone through the Middle Ages precisely because medieval people valued it, preserved it, studied it, and transmitted it. So perhaps the real cover-up is not what happened during the Dark Ages but the very concept of the Dark Ages itself. Perhaps the darkness was cast not by the people of those centuries but by later generations who needed to imagine a dark past to illuminate their own present. Perhaps what was covered up was not the absence of achievement but its presence. Achievements that didn't fit the narrative of decline and fall, that complicated the story of Renaissance rebirth, that suggested continuity where discontinuity was expected. The more we learn about the early and high Middle Ages, the more we discover that these centuries were neither as violent, nor as ignorant, nor as primitive as once believed. We find sophisticated legal systems, thriving urban cultures, international trade networks, technological innovations, artistic masterpieces, philosophical systems of great depth and subtlety. We find, in short, a civilization that was different from Rome, different from the Renaissance, different from our own, but no less worthy of respect and understanding. This is not to claim that everything was wonderful in the Middle Ages or that we should romanticize medieval life. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality high, violence common, poverty widespread, disease frequent. Most people lived hard lives with few comforts and limited opportunities. Women and minorities faced systemic discrimination. Religious and intellectual dissent was often brutally suppressed. The medieval world had very real problems and very real darkness. But these problems do not justify dismissing entire centuries as dark. Every age has its shadows, its injustices, its failures. What matters is the full picture. The achievements as well as the failures, the light as well as the darkness, the humanity of people trying to make sense of their world and improve their condition with the tools and knowledge available to them. As you drift now towards sleep, or simply rest in the quiet companionship of these voices from the past, consider what we've learned tonight. The Dark Ages, we've discovered, were not truly dark but rather dimmed by the perspective of those who named them so. The fall of Rome was not a catastrophic collapse but a long transformation. The early Middle Ages were not a period of universal ignorance but one of selective preservation and creative adaptation. The High Middle Ages saw achievements in art, architecture, philosophy, and technology that rivaled or surpassed those of antiquity. The monks in their scriptoria, the builders of cathedrals, the scholars in universities, the merchants in their counting houses, the farmers in their fields, the craftsmen in their workshops, all were participants in a living civilization, not survivors clinging to ruins of a dead one. They looked forward as much as backward, building for the future while honoring the past, creating new forms while preserving old knowledge. And so the supposed cover-up turns out to be the reverse of what we might have expected. The real concealment was not of darkness during those centuries but of light. The real myth was not about achievements that never happened but about darkness that never was. History's biggest cover-up, if we must use such dramatic language, was the covering up of the Middle Ages' genuine accomplishments beneath the label Dark Ages, the obscuring of real human achievement beneath narratives of decline and fall. But myths, once established, serve purposes beyond truth-telling. They shape how we see ourselves, how we understand our place in time, how we imagine progress and decline. The myth of the Dark Ages served Renaissance humanists who needed to claim they were reviving a lost classical heritage. It served Protestant reformers who needed to portray medieval Catholicism as corrupt darkness. It served Enlightenment thinkers who needed to position themselves as bringers of light after centuries of religious obscurantism. It served 19th-century nationalists who needed origin stories for their emerging nation-states. But we no longer need these myths. We can appreciate the Renaissance without denigrating the Middle Ages. We can acknowledge the Reformation's importance without condemning all medieval Christianity. We can celebrate the Enlightenment without pretending that reason was invented in the 18th century. We can understand nationalism's rise without inventing mythical ethnic origins in medieval kingdoms. We are free to see the past more clearly, to appreciate each age for what it actually was rather than what later propagandists claimed it to be. The study of history is in this sense a continual uncovering, a removal of layers of interpretation and myth to get at something closer to the complex, ambiguous, messy reality of the past. We never fully succeed, our own perspectives and biases always color what we see. But we can try, we can question received narratives, we can look at evidence with fresh eyes, we can acknowledge when the stories we've been told don't match the facts we discover. And what we discover when we do this with the so-called Dark Ages is a period of remarkable human resilience and creativity, of adaptation to changed circumstances, of preservation of knowledge and tradition, of building new institutions and cultural forms. We discover people who were neither primitive nor barbaric but fully human, as intelligent, as creative, as capable of achievement and as prone to failure as people of any other age. The 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century saw the transformation of Europe from a collection of Roman provinces and barbarian territories into a distinctively European civilization with its own languages, laws, institutions, and culture. It saw Christianity spread from a Mediterranean religion to the faith of all Europe. It saw the rise and fall of empires, kingdoms, and dynasties. It saw the creation of universities, parliaments, and common law. It saw the development of new technologies in agriculture, manufacturing, and warfare. It saw masterpieces of art and architecture, literature and music, philosophy and theology. These achievements did not happen in a void or despite a dark age, but because of the work of countless people over many generations, each building on what came before, each adapting to their circumstances, each contributing what they could to the accumulation of knowledge, skill, and cultural capital that we inherit. The Middle Ages were not a gap in history to be bridged, but a foundation on which modernity was built. As our journey through these misunderstood centuries comes to its close, as your breathing slows and sleep approaches or simple quiet settles around you, let this understanding sink in gently. The past is not a simple story of progress from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from barbarism to civilization. It is complex, layered, full of advances and retreats, achievements and losses, continuities and ruptures. Each age has its own character, its own contributions to make to the long human story. The people of the early and high Middle Ages were our ancestors, in culture if not always in blood. They created much that we still use, still value, still build upon. They faced challenges we can barely imagine and met them with courage, creativity, and determination. They lived full human lives in times that were different from ours but no less real, no less meaningful, no less worthy of remembrance and respect. So let us bid farewell to the myth of the Dark Ages, that comforting fiction that allowed later generations to feel superior to their ancestors. Let us instead remember these centuries as they actually were, times of transformation and building, of preservation and innovation, of darkness yes but also light, of losses but also gains, of ending but also beginning. The great cover-up was not of what happened during those centuries but of what didn't happen, the supposed universal darkness, the alleged total collapse, the imagined end of civilization. History's biggest lie about the Dark Ages was calling them dark at all. They were simply the Middle Ages, a time between other times, neither paradise nor wasteland but human society in all its complex, contradictory, creative reality. Rest now, traveler, with this knowledge settling like soft snow upon the landscape of your understanding. The Dark Ages have been illuminated, the cover-up exposed, the truth revealed. What we call those centuries matters less than what we understand about them. And what we understand, if we look honestly, is that they were filled with human beings much like ourselves, doing what humans have always done, trying to survive, trying to thrive, trying to understand, trying to create, trying to leave the world a little better than they found it. In their successes and failures, their achievements and shortcomings, their wisdom and folly, we see ourselves reflected. The distance of centuries dissolves, and we recognize that we are part of the same long human story, the endless effort to make meaning, to build civilization, to pass knowledge and tradition to future generations who will build upon what we leave them. May you rest well, dream peacefully, and wake with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of history and the continuity of human experience across the ages. The past is not as simple as we sometimes imagine, not as dark or as light, but simply human, as we are human, as those who come after us will be human, all of us together in the long journey through time. Good night, traveler. Until our next journey into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory.